Good. So I think maybe I can start with introductions, and then we can continue with the talk. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. We have a new seminar from the series of the Cambridge Ellis unit. Before starting with the talk, I want to thank the sponsors of the unit. We are thankful for their support. And I will move to introducing today's speaker. It's Neil Houlsby. Neil is going to talk today about learning general visual representations, data scaling laws, and fewer convolutions. Neil is at the moment a research scientist, staff research scientist in the Google Brain team. He's based in Zurich, and he has a broad spectrum of research interest in machine learning and artificial intelligence, with a particular focus on scalable methods in computer vision. This is related to his most recent work, and he has already been working on natural language processing at Google as well. Before joining Google, actually, he got his PhD from Cambridge. He was a student in the Cambridge machine learning group, supervised by Subin Garamani and Matej Lengel. I myself actually shared a room with him when I was a postdoc in the machine learning group. And yeah, then he was working on different topics of machine learning, from active learning, matrix, modeling matrix data, and also connections with cognitive science. And yeah, I think that's all. We are really happy to have you here, Neil. We are really excited to hear about the things you are going to talk about. And let me stop sharing these slides. I think now you should be able to share your presentation.
Okie doke.
Good. I think it's good. We can see the first slide.
Slides are up?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, super. Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction. I remember fondly my days in the CBL, and yeah, thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. So today I'm going to talk about some of our work in Google Brain on visual representation learning. And the first question to set the stage is why are we doing visual representation learning? And there's multiple possible answers to this question, but the focus of this talk is going to be on learning visual representations such that we can adapt to new or unseen tasks with little data. So one can imagine in the sort of distant future that this research could be useful for robotics or any sort of deployed system that uses vision and needs to adapt online to new environments or new instructions and such. So before we start with the machine learning, we're going to do a little bit of human learning, and to illustrate this point of learning a few data. So on this slide is a three-way classification problem with 5 examples, and so per class. And this is the training set, and this is a test image, and this is going to be a meta training episode to run through the exercise. I think most people could probably tell quite quickly that the test image is from class A. And you don't need to be a botanist to be able to do this. You don't need to know the names of these classes. I don't need to give you the names. Like just general feature learning can, general understanding of salient features enables one to do this task. Here's a second example, images from a very different distribution. We have 3 classes and a test example. And I can't see most people's faces, so I won't do a raising of hands, but maybe people can think to themselves which class they would put this example in. I'll give you a second to do a couple of epochs in the training set. Okay, anyone who thought class A was wrong, it's class B. And one more example, two-way classification. This is the test set. And surprisingly, some people struggle with this task. So if anyone can't tell what is the class of the test example, you're not the only one. But it's a counting problem. It's class A. And most people would be able to do this with, with more examples if you can do it, 6 examples, because there's many factors of variation. And so the point of, looking at some of these is to sort of get a handle on the fact that, even with few examples, our visual representations enable us to sort of pick out the salient features and perform these classification tasks, even if we can't prescribe the names of the labels. And this forms the sort of basis of the evaluation protocol for the work in today's talk. So today we're going to talk about pre-training of models and on some upstream data. And when we do this pre-training, we will be aware of the distribution of tasks that we might be required to solve. Importantly, we might not know the specific tasks, but we'll have some idea of the distribution. That might be somewhat vaguely defined. It could be, all tasks that humans can do with less than 100 examples. And we're going to train our model, and then at test time, these tasks get revealed. And each task comes with a small training set and a test set. And then the last piece that's required is our sort of algorithm needs to come with some kind of adaptation protocol that, again, this is part of the design of the algorithm that one can choose that allows one to use this model on the various different tasks. And then one gets scored, and your expected score is the performance of the model on this benchmark. And throughout the talk, I'll use pre-training or upstream training kind of interchangeably, and transfer or downstream training to refer to this adaptation and evaluation protocol. So to give an idea of some of the tasks we use, we tend to go quite broad. And this is to sort of limit the possibility of meta overfitting, and also to evaluate like different aspects of visual representation. So if your standard kind of natural classification tasks, then you have kind of specialized medical imaging tasks, and then these like counting, structured tasks, depth prediction, etc. All of these can be converted to classifications. So the API is simple, but the semantics can be quite varied. And as a quick aside, for those familiar with representation learning literature, there's kind of 2 setups that are common. One that has been very popular recently, and maybe a little bit less so very recently, is this linear evaluation protocol. So here, the adaptation algorithm is fixed. You are forced to pre-train your network and freeze it, and then you are given a new data set, and you have to retrain your final layer. And your score is how good this linear classifier can do on your downstream task. And getting a good score on this task implies a representation that enables training with a limited class of models, that class of models being linear classifiers. The transfer protocol is related, but not the same. Here, we're not saying we're limiting the class of models, but we're limiting the data. So, of course, the more data one gets, the better performance one gets with machine learning, and especially with deep learning. But we want the pre-trained representations to be able to sort of push back at this point at which the model can perform well to very few data points. So a good representation is defined as one that enables learning with limited data. And as I said at the start, this will be the focus of most of the work that we do. So to set the stage, I will briefly discuss the high-level outcomes of a study that we did now a couple of years ago. And there's lots of kind of details, but to review the main message. So this was a sort of controlled study of a lot of different representation learning algorithms, all trained on the same dataset, ImageNet, and evaluated on these 19 visual task adaptation benchmark tasks, and looking at these different buckets. And each bar in each of these plots is the average performance of models from different like algorithm classes evaluated on the tasks from the various buckets. So the generative bar is the average score of all generative pre-trained models evaluated on the various downstream tasks. And the results were interesting, but in some sense, a slightly negative result. So, and a couple of ways. So one thing we observed was that supervised learning was performing best on the natural tasks. Now, in the last year or two, there's been a lot of progress on self-supervised learning on images. So the self-supervised bar might be approaching a self-supervised bar now. But it's important to note that in the study, we controlled for a lot of things. We controlled for the architecture capacity, the resolution pre-processing, the amount of compute spent searching hyperparameters when doing fine-tuning. And so under these control conditions, supervised learning was a little bit better still. However, on the specialized and structured tasks, there was kind of nothing to say really between different algorithms. There's not that much difference. And even from scratch training was kind of close to the pre-trained models. And in particular on this sort of structured task set, just adding more data to the downstream task far outweighed being smarter in one's pre-trained representations, which was a little bit disappointing. So we looked at another axis. The second axis was, well, why don't we look at bigger models? Maybe it's just a matter of model capacity, and the pre-training loss doesn't really matter, it's just model size. And the immediate results are also a little bit underwhelming. So on this plot, we have ImageNet accuracy, which is the pre-training score on the x-axis, and visual task adaptation accuracy on the y-axis. That's the adaptation score. And of course, they're correlated. But this model in the top right-hand corner is more than 10 times larger than the model in the bottom left-hand corner. Yet it only gets 2% more when one transfers it. So there's a performance increase, but it's nothing really to write home about. It's not a very exciting performance increase. And so we thought, okay, well, the architecture size isn't helping us too much. Let's look at different data sets. And we started by looking at some larger data sets, and at Google we use a data set called JFT. It contains a few 100 million examples, so it's quite a lot larger than JFT. And we applied our kind of standard ImageNet recipe, and it completely failed. Well, training loss went down, the validation loss barely moved. So it really didn't work at all, which was disappointing. And this was really the subject of our first study, to try and figure out, there's obviously a huge amount of literature on convolution neural networks, like what were the bits and pieces that are required to make these models scale up well to data sets like JFT. And there is a massive long list of ingredients that can go into CNNs. I mean, this is deep learning. Everyone knows a lot of hyperparameters, and hundreds and hundreds of papers every single day, all proposing new tricks. And so one of these sort of contributions of this work that we called Big Transfer was to distill all of these findings down into kind of the minimal set of features that are required to make a CNN work on large data sets and transfer well. And there's basically three takeaways. Number one, vanilla ResNet works just fine, but it's not quite vanilla. It needs one minor modification, which is remove batch norm, replace it with group normalization and weight standardization. For those who have trained their own neural networks, probably know that batch norm is responsible for about 70% of the bugs. So as well as improving quality, this actually is rather nice simplification in some sense. The second thing that matters, so there's obviously a lot of ways to regularize someone's model. On large data set, the only thing that matters is weight standardization. And the unfortunate thing that we found was that if one chooses one's weight, not weight standardization, weight decay. If one chooses one's weight decay based on a short training run, one will choose a value that's suboptimal for a long training run. And one needs to train for a long time to get a good performance. And so one kind of needs this long-term view on the weight decay. And so it's just a gotcha to be aware of. And the last thing is, if we're transferring to data sets with few images, then we don't have a large validation set. And this is something that's sometimes pointed out in the literature, that you can't hyperparameter sweep on 1,000 examples and claim to be doing 10-shot learning. So the approach in transfer is not very glamorous, but it works very well. And essentially we came up with a heuristic set of 3 or 4 decision rules that allow one to set one's hyperparameters that will work on tasks with 10 examples or 1 million examples. So, if one does have a validation set, a little bit of sweeping will improve the score, but this heuristic was kind of good enough for all the results that I'll present. So once one applies this recipe, what happens? And this is one of the sort of key takeaways from this paper, was the effective scale. So each column corresponds to pre-training on a different data set. We have 1 million images on the left and 300 million images on the right. But those 300 million images are quite a lot more noisy. At least the labels have a lot more mistakes than the 1 million images from ImageNet. And as we saw before, on the left-hand side, the architecture size, which is proportional to, but reflected by the point size, doesn't give one much performance improvement. However, if one increases the dataset size to ImageNet 21K, the full ImageNet dataset that's publicly available, the performance of everything goes up. But what's curious, if one increases the data size again, the small model, ResNet 50, actually gets worse. So the increased data does not outweigh the fact that it's more noisy and the model performance is decreased. However, the larger networks don't exhibit the opposite behavior, and their performance substantially improves with a larger data set. So one needs to scale these two things kind of in proportion for everything to work. A quick aside, obviously if one trains on a lot of data, then, and as I mentioned before, the downstream task shouldn't be, so kind of the specific instances of downstream tasks shouldn't be in the pre-training data set. So we ran deduplication pipelines, and there's kind of duplicates everywhere. There's duplicates between JFT and ImageNet, which we removed. There's duplicates between ImageNet and CFAR. There's dupes between ImageNet and ImageNet. So, just something to be aware of. Fortunately, it doesn't affect the results too much. So even after removing the duplicates, the performance only changes by 0.1, 0.2%, which is reassuring, but it's still something that's good to do. So this was transferred to a medium number of examples, let's say 1,000. What about the really few shot regime? And what about evaluation on out of distribution data? So here is a thought experiment for the few shot regime. And the question is, and I want people to sort of pre-register their hypotheses here, what is more important, to have more data or a perfect domain match? And so the experiment is the following. The downstream task is ImageNet one shot. So we'll show the network for fine tuning, one example per class on ImageNet. So really extreme low data. And when we fine tune, we'll remove the classifier head of the network and retrain it from scratch. So it has to relearn the sort of few million parameters in the head and simultaneously fine tune the rest of the network. Then we'll have two models. Number one, model one is pre-trained on ImageNet. So it's pre-trained on exactly the same distribution as the downstream task. Model two is pre-trained on JFT. Also natural images, but somewhat different distribution, but a lot more images. And so the question to think about is, what do you think is better? Better domain match or more data? I wonder if there's a way. Is there a way of like voting? Take a guess.
Maybe I can say my guess. Maybe more data.
It's brave to take a guess. Anyone else feeling brave? Okay. Normally when I ask this, I get about a 50-50 split. But your hypothesis was on point, Miguel. It was more data, and we're very surprised by how much of a difference this made. So on the x-axis, we have architecture size, and the green line is pre-training on ImageNet. And regardless of the architecture size, transferring ImageNet to ImageNet doesn't ever get better than 20%. Like it's not able to relearn the head on one image per class. But if one pre-trains on JFT and the architecture side goes up, the one-shot performance goes up to like 50%. So it's very important that the representations are good, but it's not a matter of having perfect domain overlap. It's really the data scale is what is moving the needle. So another question that could be asked is, okay, this is evaluation on clean data, but are these big networks kind of brittle? Like if one shifts a little bit the test distribution, like does the performance decrease? And so this is the ObjectNet test set. The ObjectNet test set contains ImageNet classes, but the objects are kind of photographed in very unusual poses and scenarios in such a way that it's very much out of distribution compared to the nice clean ImageNet images. And all the sort of standard models, ResNet, Inception v4, etc., they get about 70, 80% on ImageNet, get about 30, 35% on ObjectNet. And we verified this with our own experiments. But curiously, again, we saw as we increased the pre-training data that the small model also didn't really work for ObjectNet, but the large model was much more robust to this distribution shift, sort of recovering a good proportion of the ImageNet performance. Not all of it. The ImageNet performance of the biggest GFT model is well into the 80s, but the performance decrease is now 20% and not 40 or 50%. So to summarize so far, the vanilla ResNet scales, scaling data or model alone is not useful, and it's surprisingly effective at few shot transfer and out of distribution.
Neil, could I ask a question regarding to the previous result? When
Yes.
you train the model with the GFT, which is 300 million images, is it possible it almost covered everything that you can have in your validation or test data set? So it is no longer out of distribution.
I think the answer to that is kind of a little bit yes and no. Clearly, the distribution is broader. These particular images in ObjectNet are not really web images. Like raters were explicitly instructed to like turn the chair upside down and photograph it beside the bed. And GFT is still collected from the web, so it's unlikely to contain very similar images to this. That said, there will probably be more coverage of unusual looking images. This data test set is also just one example. The paper in the slide sort of uses many OOG test sets, and the pattern is kind of similar across the board. So I think it's a little bit of a mix of both the sort of general feature learning as seen in the few shot and the distribution being broader.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good time for questions if there's any more. So I'll move on. We call this method big transfer. Yes,
I had a
please
question.
go ahead.
So, in your opinion, can you do you have any intuition on why batch num is not appropriate during transfer learning scenarios? In the sense, is it like the running statistics may not match with the next distribution? Is it something like that?
Yeah, I can only really speculate a little bit here. I don't know for sure why batch norm was break everything. It certainly caused a lot of trouble with distributed training because one's batch is with these large models is split across many devices, and each device only has a very small batch size. So it sort of adds quite a lot of noise into the estimation of the batch norm, like mean and standard deviation. There are ways kind of around this, but the fact that the quality was improved by removing batch norm altogether meant that we didn't have to sort of bother with some additional complexity to kind of try and improve batch norm.
I see. Right.
The other part is the sort of frozen statistics that get carried over to test time. I think if you have a very broad distribution of data, then kind of this training time, evaluation time mismatch sort of becomes more detrimental. But it's kind of a little bit of speculation.
Okay. Thank you.
So just to compare like big transfer with some other well-known deep networks, AlexNet at around 60 million parameters, and most popular networks last of 8-9 years hover around the 100 million parameter mark, with big transfer being a little bit larger, a little bit shy of 1 billion parameters. So as CNNs go, it's quite large. But if we look to machine learning as a whole, the language modeling community has scaled up a lot further. Now, of course, as a caveat, parameter counting is not a perfect measure of capacity, but we're talking 2-3 orders of magnitude difference between today's large language models and the largest CNNs. So when we're talking 3 orders of magnitude, it's something that is quite significant. And so this kind of motivated thinking about what's preventing scaling of vision models, and can we approach the problem in a different way. So clearly CNNs have been the sort of de facto architecture for quite some time, and they have a lot of inductive biases that are incredibly intuitive for computer vision, convolutions and parameter tying, and moving this kernel over the image. Pyramidal feature maps as well. However, in recent years, while LSTMs and RNNs contain a lot of inductive biases for the modeling of text, sort of transformers, sort of partly due to their ability to scale, have become kind of the de facto model for NLP. And so, the question is, if we are in this large data regime, can we sort of let the data speak and learn the patterns we want to learn directly from the data, rather than sort of handcrafting the architecture in order to learn them? And an important sub-point to that is, even if it can be made to work, is it useful? So if we could train a transformer to match a CNN, maybe that's an interesting result. But if it takes 4 times longer to train it, then it's not a very interesting. It's not a useful result. And then finally, obviously, the sort of quadratic computer memory constraints of transformers is something that is sort of always there, and a potential problem. So just to highlight that, there was we weren't the first to try self-attention in vision. There's lots of works beforehand that largely fell into 2 buckets: models that applied self-attention directly on pixels, and therefore created factorized or local center self-attention to sort of deal with this quadratic constraint. The other approach was, combining CNNs or detection models or segmentation models with attention-based models. And this was kind of popular, particularly in multimodal learning. But we wanted to try and go sort of end-to-end with the transformer. So the vision transform works as follows. The image is divided into patches, and this is kind of the main image-specific inductive bias injected into the network, this dividing into patches in the first place. We then linearly project these patches, equivalent to a convolution with stride equal to the kernel size, such that we have a sequence of feature vectors that looks like a sequence of word embeddings, as would be fed to a model like BERT. At this stage, it's a set, model on a set, and it may be important to know where the patches originally came from. So we add standard position embeddings by simply giving IDs to each patch location. Then we apply a vanilla transformer BERT encoder and extract the classification features from a dummy token. Just a reminder, the transformer encoder consists of 2 layers, an MLP applied independently to each token, and this multi-headed self-attention, which I assume everyone's familiar with. As an ablation, of course, we tried the hybrid approach, like what happens if you glue the CNN and transformer together, to see how that compares. So this figure shows the same plot as we saw earlier for big transfer, except that the bit big transfer results are shaded in this gray region, and the VIT vision transformer is now the points. And on ImageNet, vision transformer performs significantly worse. Now, subsequent work has shown that if you add a lot more data augmentation or more regularization, this can be made to match ResNet, so we can outperform. But if one doesn't apply a lot of extra tricks, then training on ImageNet results in worse performance. However, as we go to ImageNet 121K and JFT, now the vision transformer actually starts to outperform ResNets of equivalent size. So that's the sort of first, okay, and then one more plot before I move on. This, we showed the same thing in a kind of controlled study where we just took subsets of JFT. And again, the blue points start out lower. The blue curves are the vision transformers, and eventually they overtake the the CNN-based models when one reaches around about 100 million images. But as I mentioned before, it's nice that one can match the performance. So the question is, what does it cost? And so on the x-axis here, we have the pre-training flops, and the y-axis is the transfer accuracy. And the gray squares are the ResNets, and the blue points are the transformers. And what's interesting is that at all compute scales, not just large scale, but also small scale, one can match the accuracy of the ResNet with sort of 2 to 4 times less compute when pre-training the transformer. And with the hybrid, it's interesting that at small scale, it gives a little bit of a boost, but at large scale, the value of having this sort of CNN foot goes away, and it even hurts a little bit. So it was interesting to us that this result kind of carried across the, a couple of orders of magnitude of pre-training cost. And so the outcome of that was, at the time, and now this is a few months old, the VTH model was the state of the art, while being quite a lot cheaper to pre-train than equivalent models, than the CNN models that were state of the art at the time.
Can I ask one question? So you're splitting the image into these patches, and obviously you have some trade-off there into the number of patches that you use and then the cost of this. Is that right? The more patches you will have, like how do you find a balance there, or how many patches you use in an image? Or
yes, I should have. There's a figure in the ablation in the appendix. So as you decrease the patch size, the number of parameters stays constant, but the model capacity increases because you have more patches. So you get a bigger model, and it performs better. Now, if you increase the number of patches, or equivalently increase the resolution of the image, your compute will go up. And the question is whether it goes up linearly or quadratically. Because when you hit this point where you have so many patches that multi-head stable tension becomes a bottleneck, you'll get a quadratic slowdown in the number of patches. And when the multi-head stable tension is not the bottleneck, it'll be linear because the MLPs are dominating. And so we kind of push it to the point where we're before this quadratic hit. And for images of resolution 200 to 400, this is patch size 16 by 16-ish, 14 by 14. So that's kind of how we tune that one. And like all parameters of these networks, it kind of helps to scale it in proportion to everything else. So when depth goes up, width should go up, and when depth and width go up, patch size should go down, such that the sequence length kind of stays in proportion.
Okay, thanks.
Couple of kind of curiosities. I mentioned we didn't sort of add any inductive bias to the position embeddings. One can do that by encoding them in such a way that they have locality bias or 2D bias. We tried it, it didn't help, and then we looked at what was learned in the sort of agnostic position embeddings, and they kind of relearn the locality. So the position embeddings end up being kind of similar to position embeddings for nearby patches, and also some symmetry. So you have similar position embeddings kind of opposite each other on the images. A second thing that was curious to look at was the kind of receptive field size of the self-attention layers. So you can look at each head in the self-attention layer and look at how much of the image it kind of spans. And if it is a very local region, then it's acting a bit like a convolution. If it's sort of global, then it's more like just a global aggregation of signal. And in the deeper layers, all the self-attention heads are global, and in the shallow layers, they're kind of a mix of global and local. So it's sort of recovering some of the inductive bias of CNNs, but it's definitely more flexible because it's not all local self-attention being done in the first few layers. So the data and architecture size is obviously important ingredients in this study, and there's been a lot of subsequent work in exploring training these models on smaller data sets and regularizing them well and such. It's all great. We took a look at what happens at the other end of the spectrum and tried to sort of quantify a bit better, if you have a vision transformer of size X, how much data do you need to train it? And vice versa, like if you have so many images, like 10 million images, you know, how big a model does one need to learn from those? And are the scaling laws kind of similar to those that have been demonstrated in some well-known papers from OpenAI, scaling laws of language models? And so this paper has various results, and this is kind of one of the key takeaway figures. The y-axis is transfer performance, or proxy for transfer performance. Here it's ImageNet time shot, and the same appears on most, or pretty much all tasks. And the x-axis is the amount of compute, and so this is kind of the scaling laws in an amount of compute, marginalizing out other things like the amount of data and architecture size and whatnot. And the dashed line is a handcrafted fit to the Pareto Frontier. And so what can we see from here? First, where the line is straight, it's a power law behavior. And if one offsets the x and y axis, it's actually completely straight. And in fact, this is what is done in the OpenAI papers. They offset the x-axis, and then you get a dead straight line. We didn't offset the x-axis, so one can see a little bit these saturation points, because I think they're interesting. So essentially, you get a power law relationship which matches language models. At the expensive end of the spectrum, you get a saturation, and believe this is due to irreducible errors in the labeling of the data. Or like it's well known it's an ImageNet. There are some examples in the test set that cannot be classified correctly due to labeling error or inherent ambiguity. And so you will get this offset on the x-axis that corresponds to those examples that one can't get correct. The second saturation point is at the cheap end, which occurs because you can have essentially an infinitely cheap model that doesn't get an infinitely bad score. If you just predict uniform distribution over all classes, you'll get sort of 1/n accuracy. Or majority class, you could do better than that. So there's also a kind of saturation at the cheap end as well. Now, these points that fall off the frontier kind of reveal when one is training suboptimally. So these blue points that are large are small models trained on a lot of data. And these essentially show that if you have a lot of data, then these small models can't make use of it. Like they will be worse than, you need a larger model in order to make use of these larger amount of data. Conversely, these small red points are those large models trained on a small amount of data. So if you have a model at the size of VIT H or larger, like 1 million parameters or more, even 300 million examples is not enough to saturate these models. So we're really surprised by how much data is required to really squeeze everything out of these models. So the largest model we tried was 2 billion parameters. There's a few improvements to the original VIT architecture that are in the paper that are needed to kind of make this model fit into 16 gigabytes of memory. But the upshot is that if one gets the balance right, then one can get pretty good scores on well-known tasks. So this kind of scaling is interesting to study, but clearly it gets quite expensive to train these 2 billion parameter models. So there was a recent study, and there are many studies that kind of looked at the cost of training different models, and this is in the language modeling regime. And a couple of models that stood out as relatively cheap compared to their size were these two on the right-hand side of this plot from Patterson et al. And these models are sparsely gated mixture of experts. And the key feature of these models is that not every data rig point touches every parameter at every forward pass. And that's why it ends up to be cheaper to train them. And MOEs have been around for some time in language, but in vision, they haven't been sort of really scaled well. And so we worked on this and we got it to work. And so the high level view on the architecture is it's the same as the vision transformer, except this MLP layer, instead of just having one MLP that's applied to every data point, you have many. And each data point only goes to one or two of the MLPs. So, most of the MLPs don't see most of the data points. So that's why it's called experts. And the trick to make the whole thing work was not to send data points to MLPs, but actually send these patches around. So individual patches get assigned to experts as opposed to entire images. And so, yeah, the diagram one doesn't need to worry about the sort of device one, device E. It's kind of like implementation details, although important ones. The point is that each colored square corresponds to a patch, and these individual patches get sent to different experts, and there's a routing layer that gives you your routing decision. This is just a linear classifier. And then you apply your MLP to these patches, and then they get reaggregated again after the MLP into the original images, such that the self-attention can be applied across images. And this actually worked pretty well, and we're really pleased again to see that this didn't just work well at large scale, but also the very small VITs. The triangles are the MOEs, and the circles are the standard VIT recipe. That sort of across from cheap to expensive models, that one could attain the same accuracy with less compute using the Vision MOE. And yeah, this works really well when on the training set and for few shot transfer. Fine tuning is still a bit harder. It does improve in fine tuning, but a little bit less than in few shot. So there's still some open problems or challenges. One thing that can be done with these networks that's kind of fun, and we explored in the paper, but we didn't. I think it's like it could warrant a lot more exploration, is what we call batch prioritized routing and actually sparsifying the input. So just going back to this diagram, each of these MLPs has a certain capacity due to the implementation on hardware accelerators. And if you send all your patches to one MLP, there'll be some overflow and those patches will get dropped. Now, one can reduce this capacity such that some patches will always be dropped. You can say, I'm only going to process 10% of the patches in my batch. And a standard MOE will drop patches at random, just based on the order at which they happen to appear in the batch. But one can be smarter than that and come up with some decision as to which patches should receive priority. And we use a very simple heuristic for this. We just say those that have the highest routing weight get priority over those for whom there's a higher entropy in the routing decision. And with that, we can prioritize the patches. And we can do this during inference time. We can do it during training and inference time. And when it ends up with the sort of nice examples like the following, and also quantitatively it improves the model. You can reduce the compute, but keep the same accuracy. So for this image, if you have full capacity, of course, all the patches get processed. But if you reduce the capacity, it starts dropping patches. And it actually, the patches it retains are kind of really the critical ones for classifying this as a duck. I think if you just looked at these right-hand image, you would still be able to say it was a duck. And curiously, this kind of amortization of compute can be done across the entire batch, not just across one image. So it's kind of like an adaptive computation algorithm, and you kind of scratch the surface there, but I think there's a lot more to explore. Okay, so I'm seeing that about 10 or 15 minutes to go, so I'll speed up a tiny bit, but I'm on to the last section. So there's been a lot of extensions to transformative vision. There's kind of been an explosion of exploration here. I'll call out the batch partitioned ensembles from CBL's own James Allingham and colleagues. And there's really been a lot of exciting work here. And there's not only sort of version transformer extensions and Vision MOE extensions, but there's these low co-attention versions, there's hybrid versions, so there's a huge taxonomy of different networks. So I'm kind of back in this situation where we have this giant menu of possible architectures, and it's hard to choose. Which architecture should I use for my problem? So, again, we sort of thought about this, and they said, like, what is the kind of minimal set of things that we need in these vision architectures? And here's a kind of oversimplified view of vision architectures, very oversimplified. And this is kind of based on the sort of transformer view, but it sort of applies everywhere. You take your data and you split it into like local regions, right? And then after projecting those local regions with a convolution or a projection, one ends up with a table of data. And on one axis of this table, you have the tokens. That's and each token corresponds to one region of the image. And on the other axis, you have the channels, these are your features. And when you run a CNN or a transformer, you have two kinds of layers. You have those that operate on each token independently and just mix the signal within the channels. This is called MLP in a transformer. It's called one-by-one convolution in a ResNet, but it's the same thing. And on this other axis, you have either convolutions and the hundreds of variants of convolutions or self-attention. And so the other thing to try is, well, why not put the MLP on this other axis? Now it no longer really has can be thought of as a convolution. It's a kind of very weird convolution, and if you use two-layer MLP, it's actually not equivalent to a convolution at all. But it's basically applying an MLP to every single channel across the tokens to every single channel independently. So it's just a transpose of the standard one-by-one convolution. And so one could, of course, build an architecture like this, where you have a number of layers, and each layer just applies one MLP to the tokens, one LP to the channels, back and forth, and this is what we'll call MLP mixer. And so clearly this is kind of a very, very naive architecture. But again, we were kind of surprised to see that once trained with a sufficient amount of data, that essentially it lay on the same Pareto frontier, both in terms of training costs and in terms of inference throughput as the transformer, and it outperformed ResNets. And this was a sort of carefully controlled study, but if we compared to state of the art, it was also the case that essentially the model was in the mix with these super specialized like networks from various different groups, also training on JFT. And again, if we look at the Pareto frontier, the mixer falls on or near the frontier, despite having a couple of months of optimization as opposed to sort of 8 years of sort of tuning. So this was a really curious result, that the architectural components didn't matter too much. It was just a matter of having this channel and token mixing, and one could essentially match the kind of the current state of the art in vision transformers and CNNs. Now, this architecture has some sort of practical challenges, but as an area of study into what matters in deep learning and vision, I think it's a very interesting one. And just to wrap up, what happens if you add more data? With low data, the mixer is worse than the vision transformer, which is itself worse than ResNet. But as the data increase, mixer caught up. Now, of course, there's not many 3 billion image data sets out there, but the data sets that are big today will be average size tomorrow. So it's kind of look into the future. And what happens if we get to 3 billion images, the mixer actually overtook VID. So I think it's sort of designed to keep an eye on as data sets continue to grow. So to wrap up, I've talked about big transfer, the simple recipe for CNNs, letting the data doing the talking, and the vision transformer, and the sort of sparsity is an interesting avenue for scaling up without, and just sort of using one's compute in really the important parts of the data. And finally, MLP mixer kind of demonstrated that, some of these architectures didn't really matter, components didn't really matter in the end. And so the question is, what does matter? And I think that's also an interesting area of study. To wrap up, I want to sort of ask a rhetorical question, which is probably on a lot of people's minds who are researchers in this field. Like, does one need a massive amount of compute to do this kind of research? And I think the answer is clearly yes and no. But I think mostly no. So, clearly to train the next giant vision transformer and get 90-some% on ImageNet requires a lot of compute, and to work or do an internship in a large industrial lab. But there's a huge amount of research into visual representation learning and scale I think is very interesting to do. It doesn't require this huge amount of compute. And this is not an exhaustive list, but just a few things that I find interesting. Now, firstly, there's this large data, low compute regime. There's a lot of large data sets out there, like ImageNet 21K, and this is 15 million images. This is a large data set. And what we saw in the sparsity work was that the performance of these small models when trained on large data sets was very reflective of what will happen at large scale. But importantly, this is all in the low epoch regime. So we're not training for ImageNet, for 90 epochs, 300 epochs. This is like 1 to 5 epochs, because at the end of the day, these big models are so heavy that they're only going to train for a couple of epochs. So studying this large data, low compute, few epoch regime at small scale, I think is very useful for predicting what will happen at large scale. Number two, and I would have loved to have talked about this work about more time, but understanding model properties, and we've done some work on calibration and uncertainty estimates using these models. A lot of interesting findings there. Number three, finding the right balance between data regularization and architectures. There's sort of these global optimum that seem to work well, that require getting this balance right, and there's various work in this direction. And finally, general reuse. I think ImageNet checkpoints are used everywhere, but these have been far surpassed by these recent models, and many of which are made public. And I think as sort of machine learning scales up, it makes more and more sense to reuse weights that have been previously trained. And there's lots of interesting papers, like the sharpness aware minimum paper, that kind of demonstrates state of the art without having to retrain some big network, but it shows the effectiveness of this optimizer. It's tuning these pre-trained weights, amongst other things. So I'll wrap up there. Here are some references. Our code is available for all this work. The Vision MOE code, which is in the JAX, will appear soon. It's not public just yet. Here's some list of papers. My email address. Feel free to reach out if anyone wants to ask anything. And I will wrap up there.
Good. Yeah, thanks a lot, Neil. We still have a few minutes for some questions. So if anyone has some question, feel free to write something in the chat, or just to ask the question here directly. I can start with a question, and my question is about how do you do any sort of hyperparameter tuning? Now, if you have to train these large models on these massive data sets, is there any hyperparameter tuning done here, or what type of hyperparameter tuning is being done? Do you do anything on some validation data and then retrain, or what's the approach here?
Yeah. So it requires a bit of forecasting. So behind these Pareto frontiers are a lot of points in the low compute region of models we tried and didn't work so well. So we typically do a lot of hyperparam tuning at the very cheap end, then try a few hyperparameters at the sort of medium-sized end, and then forecast. And most of the hyperparameters stay the same. I mean, okay, when you go a bit larger, you reduce the learning rate a little bit. Mm-hmm. But mostly it stays the same across the board. And then the interesting question is, what does one tune the hyperparameters against? There's the pre-training dataset accuracy. If we're training on ImageNet 21K, we can create an artificial validation set from that and look at the accuracy on that. And that's good for most hyperparameters, but it's not good for everything. So, and we also don't want to spend time fine-tuning every single network we try. So one thing we found was that few-shot linear evaluation is a good proxy for what will happen when we eventually fine-tune. So often, we will look at the few-shot performance of lots of networks at small scale and check that it correlates with the upstream performance. And most of the time it does, sometimes it doesn't. Like, if the weight decay can sometimes give an inverse correlation between these two. And then tune against this few shot, and then eventually fine tune the networks afterwards.
Good, thanks. We have time for some more questions. Anyone wants to ask something? Good. I think maybe we don't have much more. Is there anyone writing something?
So one.
Oh yeah, there is something in the chat as well. Someone is asking about video. If you have any experience of what would happen with video or other types of data?
Yeah, a bit, but not tons. So one of these extension works, this video vision transformer, is from our group. That shows that transformers can kind of work for video, and that you can also kind of, and it's kind of beneficial to reuse ImageNet pre-training for video, and this works quite nicely. So we have some experience, but it's much less studied, and video comes with this additional access that you have much more data and more redundant data. So some of the recipes sort of carry straight across, and we have some experience working on ourselves. But I think video still needs a lot more thinking to sort of be as optimal as these networks are on images.
Good. I think we are just on time for the end of the seminar. Yeah, Neil, thanks a lot for joining us again. Yeah, I guess we'll see each other again at some conference also.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me.
No problem. Bye. Thanks everyone also for joining. Bye everyone.